Hi everybody and welcome to discussion 8. We're going to be talking this week about chapter 7 from Dr. Nieto's book, and we'll also be talking about the article on language brokering. It's really difficult to choose which material to include from Dr. Nieto's book. It was a really great chapter full of many valuable insights, so I encourage you to make sure you read the whole thing yourself, understanding I had to pick out just a few salient features. First, let's talk about chapter 7. Chapter 7 is divided into 4 main sections. Section 1 defines culture and discusses 7 interrelated characteristics of culture. Section 2 examines language as culture. Section 3 demonstrates the links among culture, language, and learning. Section 4 concludes with implications for teachers and schools. Let's look at each one of these sections in more detail. The first section is defining culture and its 7 characteristics. Dr. Nieto defines culture as the ever-changing values, traditions, social and political relationships, and worldview created, shared, and transformed by a group of people, bound together by a combination of factors that can include a common history, geographic locations, language, social class, and religion. Culture needs to be thought of in an unsentimental way. The socio-political context of culture needs to be acknowledged. Cultures do not exist in a vacuum. 7 key attributes contribute to understanding how culture is implicated in learning. They are complementary and interconnected, not discrete. There's a great deal of overlap among these 7 characteristics. The first characteristic, point A, is that culture is dynamic. Stephen R. Bisu describes culture as a verb rather than a noun. Cultures are hybrids. People and cultures influence one another. Cultures with less status can influence majority cultures. She particularly mentions inner-city urban culture slang becoming part of the dominant social class slang. Frederick Erikson in 1990 argued that educational practice will support the status quo when culture is thought of as static. Point B, the second characteristic, is that culture is multifaceted. Cultural identifications are multiple, eclectic, mixed, and heterogeneous. Culture cannot be conflated with ethnicity or race. In fact, Milton Gordon coined the term Eth-class to show the close correspondence of these 2 factors. Interactions with people of other cultural groups may influence culture and identity. The third characteristic of culture is that culture is embedded in context. Culture is influenced by the environment in which it exists, referring to the same point earlier about culture does not exist in a vacuum. When culture is decontextualized, students learn to think of it as separate from the daily lives of real people. And she cited an example of a student who was surprised to see that Native Americans had VCRs. The fourth characteristic, culture is influenced by social, economic, and political factors. Culture exists in concrete relationships related to access to power, power being a very important factor. Dominant social groups often determine the norm, while others are designated culturally deprived. Pierre Bourdieu, in 1986, theorized about social capital and cultural capital. In our chapter, we also saw the discussion of additive versus subtractive bilingualism, which she goes into again in the future. And what we found is that additive bilingualism creates better learners, more solid language learners, and better academic performance than subtractive bilingualism. The next characteristic is that culture is created and socially constructed. Culture constantly evolves because human beings change it in big and small ways. Such changes are made by everyday people and people in power. They are the result of decisions we, as cultural agents, make about traditions, attitudes, behaviors, and values. And as we create culture, we also are affected by culture. Culture also affects us. This great quote by Erikson, it constructs us and we construct it. The next characteristic is that culture is learned. Culture is usually learned through natural interactions, particularly with families and communities. It's not usually overtly taught. However, bilingual bicultural education is based on learning 2 languages and 2 cultural systems in order to function and succeed in different linguistic and cultural settings. And in Dr. Nieto's book, she mentions it is exceedingly difficult. She uses the comparison of taking off and putting on clothing items. It's not easy to take off and put on a culture, but rather there is a critical biculturalism that some students achieve, allowing them to switch back and forth. Finally, culture is dialectical. Cultures are dialectical, conflicted, and full of inherent tensions. Young people who choose cultures that are disparaged sometimes feel they must choose one culture only. Rafael Ramirez suggested the culture of survival and the culture of liberation. The culture of survival is developed in response to forces which may be interpreted as a threat to the survival of the culture, whereas the culture of liberation embodies the liberatory aspects of culture, and it is part of decolonization and democratization. I really like that she used the word dialectic or dialectical because it embodies the idea of conflict. I teach in a classical academy, and we use the word dialectic to refer to the junior high grades, a time period when a lot of students are transitioning between being a child and being a young adult. There tends to be a lot of conflict in their lives in one way or another. In section 2, Dr. Nieto discusses language as culture. Language is culture made manifest. And in additive bilingual homes, they are the homes in which Spanish use is continued. Subtractive bilingual homes are those in which Spanish was replaced by English. And David Dolson found in 1985 that students from additive homes outperformed those from subtractive homes. Simply speaking English is no guarantee of success. Instead, there is a need for meta-linguistic awareness, a greater understanding of how language works, and that can only occur as a child continues to speak language at more advanced levels as he or she grows, usually within the context of the family. English only can actually slow down cognitive development. In section 3, we find out about the links among culture, language, and learning. Children learn how to learn within their own cultural contexts. Different learning styles or preferences result from different child rearing styles, and that's partly the result of the research by Manuel Ramirez and Alfredo Castaneda from 1974. Dr. Nieto also notes some critiques or criticisms of learning styles in education. There's no agreement on range or number of learning styles. Studies are based on culture only. They often overly rely on culture and not the child's individual needs. And strategies developed from research can be overtly mechanical and technical, though she notes they may not have been intended as such. The terms cultural style or teaching style may be more appropriate as they indicate more of the child's world and also place some of the burden for learning and teaching on the educator. Section 3 continues. Communication process explanation is cultural and communication patterns in which a student has been socialized to learn at home and they may be missing in the school setting. That's from Erickson's research in 1993. This creates a cultural mismatch which can be remedied when teachers, schools, and students accommodate to cultural and linguistic differences. Culturally responsive education is an approach based on using students' cultures as a source of their education. For example, the KEEP program in Hawaii, where they changed their school structure to reflect the students' culture. There are some potential problems with culturally responsive education. It can unintentionally create a static view of culture. Individual diversity can be overlooked. It can draw a contrast between non-majority and majority populations, and it may sometimes hide structural inequalities that students, particularly those in poverty, may face. In section 4, we read about the implications that these findings have. The first one is that students' identification with and maintenance of their native culture and language can have a positive influence on learning. Second, the role of the teacher as cultural accommodator and mediator is fundamental in promoting student learning. And third, a focus on cultural differences in isolation from the broader school and societal context will likely not lead to increased learning or empowerment. I hope you enjoyed these points from Chapter 7. Let's move on to the reading about language brokering, and I want to make sure I give credit. Its full title is A Qualitative Analysis of What Latino Parents and Adolescents Think and Feel About Language Brokering by Rosalie Corona, Lillian F. Stevens, Raquel W. Halford, Carla M. Schaffer, Catherine Reed Quinones, and Tanya Gonzalez. The study focused on parental reactions to language brokering, why language brokering may be a positive and negative experience, cultural factors associated with reactions to language brokering, and Latino families who live in an emerging Latino community. First, they defined the term language brokering, which is an informal process of translating by Tse in 1995. In this study, the participants were 14 girls, 11 boys, 18 mothers, and 11 fathers. The interviews were conducted in English and/or Spanish, based on the participants' preferences. They had some very interesting results from their research. What they found to be true across the board was that helping the family made both children and parents feel happy and proud. The family is a central part of the culture that they were discussing, and they wanted to find out more about whether that family orientation was, how the family orientation might be influenced by language brokering. Second point that they found was that bilingualism is good. Parents and children were proud of the children's ability to speak a non-native language. Their third finding was that speaking two languages is not always easy. Students felt especially nervous in health-related situations. Parents noted that children did not always translate verbatim and that children did not understand everything. Children felt especially uncomfortable in a health-related situation when they needed to translate complicated medical terms or give bad news to family members from a doctor or other medical care personnel. Their third finding was that some describe language brokering as a team effort between parent and child. This is particularly true when the parent has some English proficiency and just needs some assistance. However, relying on children is not always easy. Some parents felt uncomfortable or even embarrassed. Some children felt intimidated by the experience, and one parent who had served as a language broker for her parents mentioned that it can disturb the pecking order of the family. Language brokering can flip things upside down, where the child has a position of authority or seeming power rather than the parent. Well, those were the major points that I saw in this week's reading. I'm looking forward to reading your thoughts about these different readings and responding to our discussion board. Have a wonderful day.